Hey, it's ArtStewart from Strategic Impact Partners, and this is What Matters Most on YouTube and LinkedIn. And with me today is GreggWard, who heads up the Center for Respectful Leadership. Gregg, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
You know, you've gotten a lot of attention with some very thoughtful pieces over the last couple of years that I've been following you and talking about how this need to kind of recalibrate what exactly effective leadership is today with what's going on with organizations. But before we get to that particular aspect, you have a really interesting journey and how you got to this work over the years. Can you just give us like a little bit of a capsule kind of summary of how you got to the center's work?
Sure. Thank you, Art, again for having me on and for that great question. I was a snot-nosed, arrogant little kid, and I was the same way as a teenager growing up on Long Island. And I didn't necessarily have much respect for the police. And I had a few run-ins with them. And then after college, while I was working in New York City as a temp, I fell into a job. I literally fell into a job developing a training program for New York City police officers on how to manage what they call emotionally disturbed persons. And we were using the techniques of live professional theater and improvisation to help them learn and practice their skills. And for the first time in my life, I saw firsthand what it was like to be a police officer, to be on the receiving end of disrespect all day long. And I realized that it takes two to tango. Respect is not necessarily a one-way street. And later on, as I worked as a journalist overseas in Europe, and I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was very fortunate to get assigned to do that. I was fascinated to see the disrespect and the respect between the East Germans and the West Germans and the Berliners, and the dynamics. They were absolutely fascinating. And eventually, I started developing training programs in the leadership space and realized that respect is really not very much understood, nor is it really valued. And therefore, it's kind of shunted to one side. And so I thought, no, I think there's a lot more to this. And eventually I wrote my book, a business fable, nice and short, easy to read, called The Respectful Leader. And that went nuts and viral. It became a bestseller and won an award. I was really fortunate. And it was brought up by Wiley, which shocked me. They picked it up. And so that's what I do now. I lead workshops, I do keynotes, I go all over the world talking about the value and the importance of respect. And people seem really, really hungry for it.
Well, what is it about the theater background? I mean, you had a theater degree from BU, right?
Yes, that's
and
right.
so you pursued a pretty successful career in theater in New York City.
Yes.
And that, as I understand it, was part of how the facilitation of those methods and that way of transforming oneself into a character, right? And the processes of all that and the narrative that goes into putting characters together to tell a story. How did all of that kind of so well work for you to then come to this natural realization of where your long-term work, about respect could go? Because it's all about behavior, right? I mean,
yeah, no one asks better questions than you are. You are the master of questions. And that truly is a wonderful, powerful question. So essentially, if you think about it, if you work in theater, it's an extraordinary collaborative art form. You have to work with other people. Even if you're doing your own solo show, you still have to work with other people, and you have an audience to interact with. So right then and there, you will not succeed in theater if you do not value the talents and skills and the knowledge and experience that the people who are working with you bring to the table. And you will not be able to create an effective piece of theater without listening to each other, without working together, without playing off and feeding off of each other. So there's an enormous amount of respect for each other that goes into making an effective piece of theater. Now, what happens outside of that for me is I understood that that was an imperative. If we wanted to be successful, we had to respect each other in order to work together. But I looked outside and I saw people disrespecting each other all over the place. And so I realized, well, if I could help them understand how effective respect can be in creating collaboration and in working together and having good outcomes, then surely they would want to do that and pick up on it. And so for me, I was steeped in respect. But by the way, theater people don't get no respect outside of theater very much. We get adulated. We get people really are amazed by our talents and skills. But at the end of the day, they think we're weird. And they don't necessarily respect us. And certainly police officers don't necessarily respect theater people because we are a little weird. We're a little wild and crazy, you know?
And, so, and you also don't get paid necessarily well in all instances either for the talent you bring to
you're not in it for the money, that's for sure. So at the end of the day, the dynamic of theater, that requirement to be respectful and work together on very intimate, intense stuff really opened my eyes to how that practice, that way of approaching the world can actually work in any environment.
Well, and isn't it kind of a little bit when you're trying to retrain someone to become more respectful in their everyday interactions and therefore make themselves more successful and effective as an executive, right? Because if you can master good, emotionally intelligent, oriented people skills, you're going to have an upper hand in how well you do with people.
Absolutely.
But isn't it kind of the theater piece too? Partially kind of retraining the impulses of the brain, because a lot of people come into these situations in the workplace having come from very disrespected contexts outside of work.
Yes.
And for them to translate behavior into a different kind of norm, which may be contrary to the survival behavior that they had to, take on outside of work, can be a difficult transition.
So many of us were raised, for example, with parents who operated under the command and control leadership philosophy. I'm your mother, do as I say. I'm your father, do as I command. And how many of us were raised? My dad was a former Marine, a lovely dad, wonderful father, but when he gave an order, we jumped. That was just what was expected. So people are very familiar with that leadership style. And of course, they take it into the workplace. And where all of our research tells us, especially the Gen X and the Gen Zs and the millennials, they bristle at that kind of leadership. They're not interested in it. It has no value. It doesn't motivate them, whereas it might have in previous generations, like baby boomers, when jobs were scarce, good jobs were scarce. That's not the case anymore. So what we're trying to say to leaders is, look, you got to adapt. You must adapt. If you don't, you're going to die. And so this is what you get paid the big bucks for, is understanding that different situations require different leadership styles. And command and control ain't the only way to get things done. There's a lot of other ways that are respectful that you can make a fundamental difference in your employees' lives, in your customers' lives. And by the way, if your employee feels respected by you, guess who they're going to treat with respect? Other employees and your customers. You can't get much better than that.
So how much of it do you think is a calibration or a recalibration of the impulse behavior when people are in certain situations, to teach them impulsively how to not do certain things or do certain things that are more within the realm of respectful behavior norms? And how much of it is the training that just comes from educating people on the mind control, to just say things differently and to be more calculating about how they conduct a more respectful way of dealing with people?
Got it.
You've got those two streams, right? You got the impulse and you have the kind of the thoughtful reprogramming to it.
Yes. And the way we go at it always, we have our our flagship program is called the Respectful Leader Workshop. And in the workshop, the very first third of it is data, information, the neuroscience of respect. It's very cerebral, if you were. It's all it's very about providing information. It's not about browbeating anybody. It's just saying, hey, look, here's how the world's changed. Here's what's going on. Here's the science involved in respect. And a lot of people are like, really? I didn't realize there was neuroscience. Yeah, it's actually very, very primitive stuff going on. So we do a lot of educating at first, and then we slowly start putting in exercises which cause them to feel, to recall emotions that they had, for example, when they were respected or disrespected, how they felt. We discuss it, and slowly, using, quite frankly, techniques of theater, we get them to start feeling what it's like to be respected, or at least remembering it. So we go at it informationally first, then we start to get them to feel, and then we lay in practices and techniques which they can then practice and do in our programs and then afterwards. So it's kind of a three-phase process: informational, feel, techniques, and practice.
Well,
and we find that's very effective.
Yeah, that seems to me would make sense, because a lot of folks, you know, if they're going to unlearn behaviors, they have to first be able to reinvent their inner emotional perspective that only they can see the world through inside themselves, right? So they've got to adjust that first in order to then be able to relearn or unlearn impulses that may not work in a more respectful situation. Let's talk about the bigger, Gregg, the larger context, if we could. I mean, certainly the political discourse in the country over the last 20 years or more has been steadily leading us towards media that is very verticalized, that not only just reflects a worldview, but even a style of how to respect or disrespect things like institutions, right? So we're getting taught respect on different kinds of levels, or disrespect on different levels throughout society. So talk if you could to some of the breakdowns that have led to where we are now. And, you know, this is a huge charge you have laid out as a mission as an organization. How are you going to tackle all that?
That's a great question also. I think from a 50,000 foot look at who we are as a nation and the dialogues that we have with each other are somewhat anecdotal, but we have been doing some research on the level of the amount of what we call public disrespect, where people are treating each other badly in public, in stores, on the street, what have you. What we're seeing, what we believe is going on, is we haven't seen this level of public disrespect since the height of the Vietnam War. What's compounded it is now we have all these media channels, and we have these damn things that we carry around with us, so we're constantly being fed a stream of clickbait, which is all about triggering very basic primitive emotions in us. Regardless of how far we have come on the conversations around race and gender differences, we are still extraordinarily in an unfortunate place. The progress has been okay, but we have so much further to go. And then we elect a Black man as president. And if anything is going to piss off a whole section of our population, it's electing a Black man as president. Regardless of where you stand politically, that was a huge sea change in our culture. And then we were off to the races in terms of people's behaviors. And whether you thought he was a good president or not is irrelevant. What mattered was the face of the president changed in a way that some people either didn't want or never thought would happen, and they went right to a very deep fear place. So it's no wonder the people who make millions of dollars off of fear ratcheted that up. So it's not a surprise that we are where we are. The question is, are we willing to own that and to do something about it. And I think the jury is still out. I don't know.
Well, I think there's a lot of encouraging news on the organization front, on the business front, because what has become clear with recent Supreme Court decisions, other things that have been happening in the public policy space, is that the citizenry is being forced to make decisions about getting more involved if they expect to be able to retain certain rights and privileges under our constitutional democracy. And so there's a call for a new resurgence of activism just to protect some of the most basic freedoms that we have taken for granted.
Yes.
And I think that can be encouraging, because companies also are understanding the importance of what the best of class employees value the most.
That's right.
If they're going to work for you. And it includes honoring human rights, honoring civil rights, being neutral about all of those kinds of things, and providing equal access and opportunity to all employees of all walks of life. And where political decisions get made about access to basic rights, then infringe on employees in certain states to exercise those rights. Businesses are obviously deciding that maybe it is within their role in a changed world to have to step up to make up for that access.
I think so. And again, we look at our employees. By 2025, roughly 50% of all employees will be either millennials or Gen Zs.
Right.
So those folks are the highest educated generations in history. We've never had more people with more higher education than in the workplace than ever before. They are not stupid. They are passionate about the world. They recognize at their core that diversity, which has become a politicized term, but diversity is actually very, very good for business. The data is clear. So I have a client, for example, been around over 100 years, and their the employee base has changed so radically in the last 15 to 20 years, you would not recognize it. If you had been an employee 20 years ago, you would not recognize it today. It is the most diverse in its history, and it's extraordinary. And in the past, that wasn't even thought of. It wasn't an issue. Now the leadership care very deeply about maintaining respect for the diversity of all employees, because they know that's what's good for their business and for their clients as well. So at the end of the day, regardless of our political feelings about diversity, it's here to stay. People do care about it. And we have more and more employees who really want to make sure they're working for a company that has integrity, that is doing the morally right thing, and not just there to just reap windfall profits without any kind of integrity or a stand for decency and respect.
Well, and as I said, I think from my perspective, there's more encouraging news of late than not. And companies stepping up to make healthcare access an important thing to maintain during some of these changes, as well as other stuff. So, yeah, so it is a good thing. So, if organization leaders in your mind could do one or two key things to help improve the call to more respectful cultures in organizations, what would you suggest would be those one or two things that they could do right now?
Well, the first thing I would recommend they do is go way beyond go way beyond talking the talk and start walking the talk. There are a lot of organizations who, after the murder of George Floyd, made statements about inclusivity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's great. That's great. But some of them engaged in what I call performative diversity, performative DE&I, where they said the right things, they put it up on the website, but really it was business as usual. Don't just do the performative stuff. In fact, our millennials and our Gen Zs are so attuned to smelling BS that if you do a bunch of performative stuff and you don't back it up with actual actions, you've actually done worse than if you hadn't done anything at all. So if you're going to talk about it, then you better walk it. That's one thing. The second is, it is time to stop giving a pass to our leaders who consistently behave disrespectfully, but because they're either a founder or they're a rainmaker or they're politically connected to the board of directors, what have you, we need to stop giving them a pass and say to them in no uncertain terms, you will either change your behavior or you will not be a part of us anymore. And I know how hard that is to do, but we have to remember that disrespect is super expensive. And I've got the data. Just ask me. I could show you chart after chart after chart how much it costs your company when you have a culture of disrespect. It's really expensive. It's not just the cost of doing business. It actually has significant bottom line impacts. So I find a lot of the time I have to go out and speak with CEOs and say, let's look at this data here. Let's look at your turnover. Let's look at your your settlements and your complaints. And let's look at all this stuff. You really want to just
Productivity.
you okay with that? Yeah, productivity. Turnover. You okay with this? If you are, okay, then I can't help you. But if you want to make it better, start with respect. Start with respect. Make sure you get rid of those bad actors who are ruining it for everybody else. Hard to do, easy to say.
Well, hard to do, easy to say, but it's also a priority today, right? Because one of the biggest things that's working against organizations being able to better handle unanticipated disruptions in the future, like what we've just gone through with COVID,
right,
is to get rid of the toxicity.
Yes.
In the culture, to get rid of the politicalization of the organizational structure that supports information hoarding, siloing,
yes,
political fiefdoms, all the things that work against true and authentic collaboration. And if you're going to comply with anything in the ESG space today, you cannot fake the transparency and the accountability that's now required of markets, both in a fiduciary sense and in all other regulatory senses with the new ESG requirements. So it's a new world out there, right, Gregg? And but we'll keep talking. It was great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Center for Respectful Leadership, GreggWard, ArtStewart here. And we'll see you next time. Strategic Impact Partners, What Matters Most on LinkedIn and YouTube. We'll see you then.